The sound of creaking floorboards echoed through the nearly empty bar as sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting long streaks of light across the wooden floor. Jack Morgan, the owner of Morgan's Last Stand, was wiping down the counter, his usual routine at this hour. The bar had been in his family for 3 generations, and every worn stool and scuffed floorboard carried the weight of countless stories. It wasn't just a business to Jack, it was a legacy, a piece of his heart. Jack, a man in his early 40s with a lean build and sharp, weathered features, wore his usual outfit, a beige shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, jeans that had seen better days, and boots that could tell their own tales of hard work. His hands were calloused, his arms strong from years of labor, but his demeanor was calm and measured. He didn't need to boast or intimidate. His presence alone spoke volumes about the kind of man he was, steady, resolute, and unyielding. As he finished wiping down the counter, the faint hum of a motorcycle engine cut through the quiet. Jack's hand froze mid-swipe, and he tilted his head toward the sound. It wasn't unusual for bikers to pass through town, especially with the highway nearby. But something about this particular rumble felt different. It wasn't one bike, it was several, the deep growls of their engines reverberating through the stillness like an approaching storm. Jack set the rag down and straightened up, his keen eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the windows. The engines grew louder until they stopped abruptly outside the bar. The silence that followed was almost more unsettling than the noise. Jack moved to the door, his boots heavy against the wood, and peered outside through the narrow window. 4 bikes, all gleaming chrome and black leather, stood parked haphazardly in front of the bar, their riders dismounted with deliberate slowness, each movement dripping with an air of calculated menace. They were a mix of ages, but all bore the hallmarks of seasoned bikers, leather jackets adorned with patches, tattoos snaking up arms and necks, and an unshakable air of defiance. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a thick beard, glanced at the bar with a smirk before gesturing to the others to follow him inside. Jack stepped back from the door and took a slow, steady breath. He had seen men like these before, brash, overconfident, and looking for trouble. They weren't here for a drink, and Jack knew it. He moved back behind the counter, his hand brushing against the heavy wooden bat he kept tucked out of sight beneath it. He didn't expect to use it, but it was there if things got out of hand. The door swung open with a creak, and the bikers filed in, their boots thudding against the floor. The leader took the center, his broad frame dominating the room as he walked up to the counter. His eyes swept over the bar, taking in the details with a mix of disdain and amusement. "Quiet place you've got here," the leader said, his voice rough and gravelly. "Bet it doesn't see much excitement." Jack met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "We get by," he replied evenly. The leader smirked and leaned against the counter, his large hands splayed across the worn wood. "Well, maybe we can liven things up for you," he said, his tone carrying a thinly veiled threat. "My boys and I are looking for a place to hang out. A home base, you might say." Jack's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "This isn't that kind of place." The leader chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Oh, I think it could be, with a little persuasion." He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "Here's the deal, friend. You let us use your bar, no questions asked, and we'll make sure nothing happens to it, or to you." The other bikers spread out, their presence filling the room with a palpable tension. One of them began examining the shelves of liquor, while another picked up a stool, spinning it lazily as if testing its weight. Jack's hand instinctively drifted closer to the bat under the counter, but he kept his composure. "And if I say no?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The leader's smirk widened, his teeth glinting like a predator about to strike. "That'd be a bad idea, real bad. You wouldn't want to find out how bad." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Jack's eyes flicked to each of the bikers, calculating, assessing. He had faced intimidation before, but this was different. They weren't bluffing. They were here to take what they wanted, and they wouldn't stop unless someone made them. Jack's grip tightened around the counter's edge. "You've got your answer," he said, his tone dropping like a hammer. "This bar isn't for sale, and it sure as hell isn't yours to take." The leader straightened up, his smirk vanishing as his face hardened. "You're making a mistake, old man." Jack didn't flinch. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." The air crackled with tension as the bikers exchanged glances, their bravado now mixed with a flicker of uncertainty. The leader leaned in one last time, his voice a low growl. "We'll be back, and when we come, you'd better think real hard about your answer." With that, the bikers turned and marched out, their boots echoing through the now empty bar. Jack watched them go, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. He knew they weren't bluffing. They would come back, and when they did, he would be ready. Jack stood behind the counter long after the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance. His mind was already racing, assessing the situation like he had done countless times before during his years in the army. Trouble wasn't coming, it had already arrived. The bikers' threats weren't idle, they were a promise. And Jack knew that if he didn't stand his ground, they would take everything he and his family had worked for. The bar wasn't just a business to Jack, it was a legacy, a connection to his late father, who had built the place from the ground up after coming home from the war. Jack had grown up in Morgan's Last Stand, learning not just how to run a business, but how to treat people, with respect, fairness, and an understanding that everyone had their own battles. Those principles were etched into every corner of the bar, from the well-worn stools to the faded photographs on the walls. But the bikers didn't care about any of that. To them, the bar was just another prize to claim, another trophy for their collection. Jack had seen men like them before, bullies who thrived on fear and intimidation. He also knew that bullies only backed down when they were forced to. Jack had no intention of giving them an inch. The rest of the day passed in a haze of preparation. Jack didn't bother calling the police. He'd seen enough to know that filing a report wouldn't stop men like the Iron Fangs. They operated outside the law, using fear to keep their victims silent. No, this was a fight Jack would have to handle himself. He started by reinforcing the bar. He replaced the locks on the doors with heavy-duty deadbolts and installed metal bars over the back windows. He moved the cash register to a hidden compartment under the counter and rigged a few surprises in case the bikers decided to get aggressive. Jack wasn't a violent man, but he believed in being prepared, and if they forced his hand, he wouldn't hesitate to protect what was his. As night fell, Jack sat alone at one of the corner tables, a cold beer in hand. The bar was quiet, the only sounds coming from the faint hum of the jukebox and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was the calm before the storm, and Jack knew it. He wasn't afraid, but there was a heaviness in his chest, a mixture of anger, determination, and a deep sadness for what the bar had become. This wasn't how his father would have wanted things to be. The next evening, the bikers returned, just as Jack had expected. Their motorcycles roared down the street like a pack of wolves, the sound growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. Jack stood behind the counter, his arms crossed and his expression calm, though his heart was pounding in his chest. The leader, the same broad-shouldered man with the shaved head and thick beard, was the first to enter. He scanned the bar with a smug grin, as if already claiming it as his own. His crew followed close behind, their heavy boots thudding against the floor as they spread out like predators circling their prey. "Evening," the leader said, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Thought we'd stop by and see if you've had a chance to reconsider our offer." Jack didn't move. "I haven't," he said evenly, "and my answer's the same." The leader chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but guts only get you so far." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped closer to the counter. He picked up a glass and examined it, his expression one of exaggerated disgust. "This place could use some sprucing up," he said, tossing the glass onto the floor, where it shattered into pieces. Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out a clean rag, tossing it onto the counter with deliberate calm. "You're not going to scare me," he said, his voice steady. "And you're not going to take this bar." The leader's grin faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. He leaned against the counter, his massive frame towering over Jack. "You think you can take us on, old man? You think you can stop us?" Jack didn't flinch. "I don't have to stop you. I just have to show you that this isn't worth the trouble." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out. Then, without warning, one of the bikers lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the counter and flipping it upward. The sudden movement sent bottles crashing to the floor, the sound echoing through the bar like gunfire. Jack moved quickly, sidestepping the counter and grabbing the bat he had hidden behind it. He didn't swing it, not yet. He held it firmly in both hands, his eyes locked on the leader. "You've got one chance to walk out of here," he said, his voice like steel. "Take it." The leader's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. He signaled to his crew, and they began to close in around Jack, their movements slow and deliberate. Jack's grip tightened on the bat, his muscles coiled like a spring. He wasn't going down without a fight. Before anyone could make the first move, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside caught everyone's attention. The door burst open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Tommy, Jack's nephew, and a former linebacker who had spent years working as a bouncer. Behind him were two of Jack's old army buddies, men who had seen their fair share of combat. "Looks like you boys picked the wrong bar," Tommy said, his voice low and menacing. The bikers hesitated, their confidence wavering as they sized up the new arrivals. Jack's reinforcements didn't need weapons to make an impression. Their presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power. The leader sneered, but the bravado in his expression was beginning to crack. "You think this is over?" he said, his voice tight with frustration. "You're making a big mistake." Jack lowered the bat slightly, his gaze unwavering. "The only mistake is thinking you could push me around. Now get out of my bar." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their unity beginning to fracture. The leader's pride kept him rooted in place for a moment longer, but even he could see the writing on the wall. With a growl of frustration, he turned on his heel and stalked toward the door, his crew following close behind. As the sound of their motorcycles faded into the night, Jack exhaled slowly, his grip on the bat relaxing. Tommy clapped him on the shoulder, a proud grin on his face. "You handled that like a pro, Uncle Jack." Jack nodded, though his expression was weary. "It's not about handling it," he said. "It's about making sure they don't come back." Jack stood in the aftermath of the confrontation, the faint sound of the bikers' roaring motorcycles fading into the distance. The tension in the room hung heavy, mingling with the lingering scent of spilled liquor and the metallic tang of broken glass. He set the bat down on the counter, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Around him, the bar was in disarray. Overturned stools, shattered bottles, and scuff marks on the wooden floor from the scuffle. But it was still standing. He was still standing. Tommy and Jack's two army buddies moved quickly, righting chairs and sweeping up the broken glass. "You sure they're not coming back, Uncle Jack?" Tommy asked, his broad shoulders tense as he glanced toward the door. "They'll think twice before they do," Jack replied, his voice steady but tired. He leaned heavily against the counter, his sharp eyes scanning the room as though assessing the damage went deeper than the physical mess. "Men like that thrive on fear. You show them you're not afraid, and you take away their power." Tommy nodded, his respect for his uncle evident. "Still, maybe we should stick around for a while, just in case." Jack gave a faint smile. "I wouldn't mind the company," he admitted, though there was no weakness in his words. It was a practical acknowledgement of the lingering threat, and a quiet appreciation for the people who had his back. As the hours passed and the bar was tidied up, Jack couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. Morgan's Last Stand had always been a place of community and safety, a haven for the people in town. That bikers like the Iron Fangs thought they could waltz in and take it over felt like a personal insult. Not just to Jack, but to his family's legacy. They didn't understand the depth of what they were trying to destroy. This bar was built on hard work, sacrifice, and a stubborn refusal to give up. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Jack was already back at work, repairing the damage with the same determination that had carried him through years of service. His hands were steady as he hammered nails and replaced broken glass, each movement a silent declaration. This place would endure. The bikers didn't return that day, nor the next. Word of what had happened spread quickly through town, and Morgan's Last Stand became the subject of hushed admiration. Customers trickled in, offering Jack words of support and quiet gratitude. Even the sheriff stopped by, tipping his hat and saying, "Heard you handled some trouble the other night. If they come back, you let us know." "I will," Jack replied, though he doubted he'd need to. The bikers had made their point, and so had he. Still, Jack remained vigilant. He knew men like the Iron Fangs didn't always take their losses gracefully. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension began to ease. The bar returned to its usual rhythm, filled with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional tune from the jukebox. life moved on, as it always did. One evening, as Jack stood behind the counter, pouring a beer for an old regular, he spotted a familiar face in the doorway. It was the leader of the Iron Fangs. Though he was alone this time, his posture less imposing, his expression subdued. Jack's hand hovered near the bat under the counter, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he met the man's gaze, his own expression calm and unreadable. The leader hesitated, then stepped inside, removing his leather jacket as a sign of respect. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice low but sincere. "We were out of line. You didn't deserve that." Jack studied him for a long moment, weighing the words. He didn't trust them completely. Trust was earned, not given. But he nodded nonetheless. "Takes a big man to admit when he's wrong," he said. "I appreciate it." The leader extended a hand, and after a brief pause, Jack shook it. There was no fanfare, no grand resolution, just a quiet understanding between two men who had both seen their fair share of fights. The leader left shortly after, and Jack returned to his work, feeling a small weight lift from his shoulders. That night, as Jack closed up the bar and locked the doors, he looked out at the empty street and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had stood his ground, protected his home, and defended what mattered most. Morgan's last stand had lived up to its name, and as long as Jack was around, it always would.